The Chasm and the Collision by Robert Alessar. Copyright 2017 by Robert Alessar. All rights reserved. Any reproduction of this copyrighted material by any means without the express written consent of the author is strictly prohibited. For Jacob and Kira, all the way. Chapter 2. Shared Visions. The next day, Alex felt groggy from missed sleep, but otherwise not much the worse for his strange night. He hadn't forgotten the dream, nor the terrifying sound and sight that had followed. In the light of day, however, it was much easier to accept the conclusion that he had been hearing and seeing something that his imagination had magnified in the middle of the night. He couldn't quite get the idea all the way through his head. He wasn't quite sure that he hadn't really seen what he thought he had seen, but he was able to convince himself well enough to get on with his day. The usual morning barely contained disorder in Alex's house passed without any noticeable sign that his parents had lost sleep at all, which reassured him. He ate a very small breakfast of buttered toast with a glass of milk, not unusual for him. He finished quickly, then grabbed his school bag and, saying goodbye to his mother and father, walked out the front door and headed toward school. It was a bit chilly that morning, but Alex's light jacket was more than enough to keep him comfortable while walking. In the afternoon, when it was warmer, he tended to stuff the garment into his book bag, as he had done the previous day. The sun shone brightly, and Alex saw a scattering of newly fallen buds on the front lawn as he walked out. He didn't expect to see Simon or Megan in the morning. He liked to start his day early, getting to school when it was still quiet, which gave him a chance to go over his homework one last time before everyone else arrived. Simon didn't really have to do such a thing. In fact, Simon was usually done with his homework before he left school for the day, so he generally arrived just a few minutes before class. It was one of the other things that led Alex to be just a bit envious of his friend, though it didn't bother him nearly as much as did Simon's easy relationship with Megan. As he walked, Alex thought about Megan's behavior the previous afternoon. She had been so serious about finishing her share of the berries before she got home, and so cautious about them from the start. Her parents must be extremely strict about eating between meals, Alex thought, and he couldn't quite fully understand it. His own mother encouraged him to eat healthy food, certainly, but as his father also said, boys Alex's age just had to eat a lot. Alex knew that girls didn't tend to eat as much as boys, but still, it was fruit for crying out loud. Alex rounded the last corner and saw his school up ahead on the right, with its old-fashioned red brick facade bearing two sets of double doors in front, and with flagpoles centered on the courtyard before and between them. The school property was dominated by many impressive oak and maple trees that must have been there for decades, for they were all very tall. Beyond the far end of the school, from Alex's point of approach, the grounds spread out a good distance before coming to the next street. The trees ended in plenty of time to provide space for an informal game of full-scale football, even with the permanent baseball diamond in the far left corner of the lot. At the other end, hidden from Alex's current view, was another baseball diamond nestled against 4 fenced-in tennis courts. These were not well kept, with cracks in their pavement from which grass and dandelions would spring up during warm weather. The only outdoor basketball hoop on the grounds was along a slight widening in roadway that led to the teachers' parking area, and thus was only usable on evenings or weekends. Alex climbed the steps to the front door nearest him and walked into the school. His locker was on the second floor, next to his homeroom. He walked up the 2 flights of the nearest stairway, which looked as though it belonged more to an old-fashioned public library than a middle school. Then he turned to the right at the top and went toward the rear of the building. There were very few other students present yet, but that would change within a mere 10 or 15 minutes. Alex's locker was on the left side of the hall as he approached his homeroom. He walked up to it and dialed his locker's combination without thinking. He apparently got it right, because it opened as usual. He swung the door wide, stowed his jacket on a hook, and took out the books for his first few classes, some from the locker, one from his bag. He also took his notebook and his small pencil case out of the backpack, then closed the locker, sealed and spun the dial on his lock randomly, and walked to homeroom. He was surprised to see Simon already seated at a table on the far side of the class next to the windows overlooking the courtyard. After a moment's startled pause, Alex ambled over and sat down next to his friend. "Hey, Simon," he greeted. "Weird to see you here this early." "Yeah," Simon said with a nod. "I had a bad sleep last night, and I still couldn't sleep this morning, so I decided to just get up and come in. My mom was pretty surprised, too. On closer examination, Simon did look like he hadn't slept well. His eyes were slightly red, and his usually intent face seemed just a bit slack. His hair was also mildly disheveled, as though he hadn't put more than a minimal effort into straightening it when he got out of bed. "How come you couldn't sleep?" Alex asked. Simon glanced up almost sheepishly. For a moment he didn't answer at all, but then finally he just shook his head and replied, "I don't know. I just couldn't seem to get comfortable." Alex was pretty sure there was more to Simon's lack of rest than he was admitting, but decided not to press him on the issue. It was a topic that made Alex think about his own nocturnal disturbances, and since what had happened to him was almost certainly more bizarre than what had happened to Simon, he felt that he had no business interrogating his friend. Instead, he changed to a subject nearer and dearer to his heart. "Hey," he asked, "what's the deal with Megan being so worried about eating too much or having snacks or things?" "Huh?" Simon asked, apparently caught off guard by the abrupt change of topic. "Oh, that. Yeah, her mom's always been strict about what she eats and stuff. I mean, part of it's just shyness, but she really does seem to be uptight about not letting her eat too much or get too fat or anything. Doesn't seem healthy to me, but what do I know?" Alex replied, "Probably a lot. I mean, come on, she's not even a full-fledged teenager and way far away from being fat. What's their worry? I mean, is her mom or dad fat?" Simon blinked before answering, "No, not really. I mean, neither of them are built like models or anything, but they're not heavy either. They're normal." Alex murmured. "I was thinking there might be some kind of reaction to that or something. Maybe someone in one of their families was really heavy." Simon shrugged and said, "I don't know. I've never talked to her about it. She's kind of touchy about the whole thing, like I guess you noticed." He stifled a yawn, then went on, "Anyway, why are you thinking so much about this?" "I don't know," Alex replied. "Just kind of freaked me out how worried she was about even trying the fruit in the first place, and then about eating too much." "Oh," Simon said with a nod. "Well, I mean, the first part, where she was so nervous about trying the fruit, was probably because she used to get teased a lot when she was younger. Maybe she still does, but I don't think it's as much. I mean, she's always been shy and kind of nervous, and her mom's a little high-strung, so people tend to pick on her and play pranks." Alex felt a surge of anger and said, "Man, people really suck sometimes, don't they? I'd like to beat the crap out of anyone who teased her." Simon smirked. "Aren't you noble?" he asked. "The Night Protector." Alex felt a surge of disquiet at Simon's words. "What do you mean? What am I protecting at night?" Simon burst out laughing and said, "Not night, night. Knight. The Night Protector, you know, like a medieval thing." "Oh," Alex breathed, quite embarrassed, since he should have recognized Simon's meaning without help. It seemed the concept of night was still very much on his mind. He was about to try to make some joking comment that implied that he had deliberately misunderstood Simon, trying to be funny, but he was distracted by something outside. Through the homeroom windows, he could see across the makeshift football field and well into the surrounding neighborhood. In the mornings, there was always visible movement and activity as people took out their garbage, sent their kids off to school, got into their cars to head to work. It was all so normal that, frankly, Alex never paid any attention to it. Now, however, something had caught his attention and drew his gaze across the field toward the wall between the tennis courts and the first house after the school grounds. The wall did not go all the way to the street, but stopped just after coming even with the rear of the house in question. At first, Alex wasn't sure what had pulled his focus there. Had something been moving? Something that, out of the corner of his eye, had seemed strange enough to interrupt his thoughts? At first, he couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. The house was small, a one-story brick structure with a side yard only about 10 feet wide between it and the school grounds. It was well tended and clean, and nothing seemed out of place. Then Alex blinked. What he had taken to be a tree root, or perhaps a piece of inner tube, maybe even some kind of a garden barrier, lay on the ground extending a few feet past the end of the wall, its remaining length hidden from view. As Alex watched, the root twitched briefly, moving from side to side. Then it raised itself off the ground in a curl from the end, apparently under its own power. It twitched back and forth again, more vigorously, and then pulled forward. In seconds, it was completely obscured by the wall, which was taller than an ordinary man's height. That had not been a root, or a garden decoration, or a discarded piece of tire. From what Alex could see, it had looked for all the world like some large, almost reptilian tail. Alex blinked about a dozen times. He must have been holding his breath, because he soon found himself forced to expel it in a quick release, during which he said to himself, "What the frack was that?" Simon, startled, asked, "What the frack was what?" Alex glanced over to find Simon looking at him with a puzzled expression. Alex stared back for several seconds, not answering, because he really wasn't sure that he wanted to do so. No, he was increasingly sure that he did not want to tell Simon that he thought he had just seen something like the tail of a dinosaur disappearing behind a wall through their homeroom window. Instead, he shook his head and tried to think of some other explanation for his exclamation. "No, I got a little dizzy, that's all. Not sure why." Simon raised an eyebrow, asking, "Dizzy? That's weird, but then I guess you were holding your breath. You feel okay?" Alex, who glanced back out the window quickly and, he hoped, surreptitiously, before looking back at Simon, did not feel okay. The things he had experienced the night before were bad enough, but that was nighttime, and they could be explained by dreams and near dreams. Now it was broad daylight, and he was wide awake. There was no simple explanation for what he had just seen. It had not been just a trick of the light, and though he would like to have thought so, it had not been just some hose dragged by an unseen person behind the wall. The thing had twitched and wagged. I don't know," he finally said, too frazzled to try to be dismissive. "I think I just didn't get enough sleep last night either." "Really?" Simon asked, with another characteristic eyebrow lift. "How come you didn't get enough sleep?" Alex looked at Simon's face. Was he asking that question out of more than idle curiosity? Alex thought he saw something more in his friend's expression than casual interest. He almost got the idea that Simon was frightened yet eager, and that was a disquieting impression. Though tempted to tell Simon the whole truth about his nocturnal experiences and about what he had just witnessed, Alex couldn't quite clear the hurdle. Instead, he answered, "Kind of an upset stomach." "Oh," Simon said, and a good deal of tension seemed to leave him. "That sucks. Maybe that's why you're dizzy, too. I mean, you throwing up?" Alex, distracted by what he had seen, almost didn't follow the point of Simon's question, since he had told his small lie without much thought. "Huh?" he asked, before reconnecting to his own statement. "Oh, no, I didn't throw up, just queasy." His last word trailed off a bit, and he took another quick glance out the window, but saw no further sign of the reptilian projection. Simon nodded without evident suspicion and said, "Still, that's probably why you felt dizzy. You sure you ought to be in school today?" Again, Alex was taken aback by Simon's question, because he wasn't truthfully experiencing any illness, at least not any physical illness, though he was beginning to doubt his own mental health. "Yeah," he finally answered, "I don't have any upset stomach now. I think maybe it was just something I ate." Simon nodded seriously. He looked up and around the room, and Alex followed his gaze, happy to be distracted. While the two had been speaking, a good number of other students had begun to filter into class. Since homerooms were assigned randomly in their middle school, no other close acquaintances of theirs were in its small population, so no one came to join in their conversation. Nevertheless, it was starting to get a bit crowded, and soon the teacher, Mr. Anderson, would come in to take roll and just to be present when the morning PA announcements came on. Alex shook his head, not wanting to have to be careful of his conversations with the distraction of so many students around. He also, to be honest, didn't want to think too much about what had been happening. There had to be an explanation, one that he hoped wouldn't involve him needing to take medication for the rest of his life, but he couldn't see it yet, and he couldn't concentrate upon it. He needed a distraction, and as before, he sought out his favorite one. "Man, I can't wait until second period," he said. Simon was caught off guard by the non sequitur. This time both of his eyebrows went up, and he simply asked, "Why?" Alex was surprised that Simon had to ask. "Well," he answered, "we're working on those group presentations, and Megan's in my group." Light dawned in Simon's eyes, and he nodded with a return of his amused smirk. "Of course," he said, "I should have realized. I must be tired. What else could make you look forward to an English class? Trying to respond normally, Alex said in mock offense, Hey, I love literature as much as anyone. Well, not anyone. Not as much as you, or the teacher, or the average construction worker. Simon laughed. Hey, don't diss construction workers. My uncle's worked in construction his whole life, and he's read more books than I think I ever will. Alex knew Simon's uncle since the two boys often went to each other's family events. Yeah, but doesn't he own his own construction company, he said? Sure, Simon answered, but he didn't start off that way. He worked his way up. Anyway, the point is that he loves literature, and so do a lot of people. You're just not one of them. I love the Harry Potter books, Alex said, glad to be further distracted from dinosaur appendages and flying manta rays. They're awesome. I've read them all. Simon tilted his head in mock impatience. That's not saying much. I mean, who doesn't love the Harry Potter books? They started having newborn babies read them before they let him go home from the hospital. Alex laughed, and more tension left him. The remaining few minutes of pre-homeroom time passed pleasantly enough in a light-hearted debate about just how much Alex cared for reading and whether his choices of subject would impress anyone. Then the white-haired, dour Mr. Anderson walked into the room and made his usual proclamation, Around and quiet. They called all the students to face the front of the room while he checked attendance, and they waited for morning announcements. Even through all these ordinary things, though, Alex's mind was intruded upon by images of strange creatures, sounds of stranger ones, and the vision of a gigantic, impossible edifice in a dream. First period, which was algebra, passed uneventfully. This was a class that Alex shared with Simon, a fact that made it a bit better than it might have been otherwise. Though he occasionally needed his friend's help with some of the tougher problems, Alex was reasonably good at math and had to admit to himself that he liked it, especially today. Something about the inescapable consistency and logic was reassuring at a time when he felt his own reason slipping. The hour passed without any strange occurrences and without any discussion of lost sleep, fictional stomach upset, or anything else that made Alex feel uncomfortably out of bounds. When algebra came to an end, Alex waved goodbye to Simon, whom he would be seeing again in history class in fourth period. He then headed downstairs quickly, eager to join in the group discussion of The Crucible and to work on preparing a presentation. He did not, unfortunately, appreciate the play itself. He thought it was really something they should have waited a year or a decade before making him read. But working with Megan made it worthwhile. He probably would have been willing to read and discuss the ingredients of various popular snacks if it was with Megan. So it was with a smile already on his face that Alex entered the literature classroom and looked over to where Megan sat, already in place, her books out. Her head was down, and she was intent upon some form of written project, though Alex was not able to tell what it was from the doorway. Alex's seat was usually across the room from Megan's, but since the class had been reorganized into teams for the next 2 weeks to discuss their reading and propose presentations on their plays, it was natural for him to speak to her. Trying to be casual, Alex strode over to Megan's side of the class, approaching from behind. As he got close, wishing not to startle her, he said, "Hey, Megan, how's it going?" Megan looked up a little distractedly, apparently intent upon what she was doing. Still, she didn't hesitate to reply, saying, "Oh, hi, good morning." Alex noted that she didn't use his name and was suspicious that she might have forgotten it again, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions, especially ones that made him feel about 2 inches small. Trying to keep his spirits up, he said, "You ready to get to work on The Crucible?" Again, Megan seemed distracted, and Alex thought that maybe she looked tired as well. There seemed to be something going around with respect to sleep, though it was unlikely that her sleep had been interrupted in the same way that his had been. In response to Alex's question, Megan answered, "I guess so. I'll put this away." She leaned back from what she was doing and looked down at it, as if in pensive contemplation. Alex followed her gaze. She hadn't been writing anything, as it turned out, but had been drawing. In fact, Alex saw a small box of colored pencils on her desk, so the drawing she had made was not simply black and white. He hadn't realized that she was an artist, though he thought it suited her character, but he was interested in seeing what sort of things she drew. When he looked at the drawing, all other thoughts flew from his mind. There, on a plain white sheet of paper drawn in simple but colorful style, was a simplified but good reproduction of the gigantic edifice which had been central to Alex's dream the previous night. Megan had even drawn it projecting off the edge of a cliff and floating in the air as Alex had seen it, though the bottom turret was not completely visible in the angle she had chosen to illustrate. The colors of the structure and of the surrounding area, as well as the sky and the clouds, were all representative, essentially, of what Alex had seen in his dream. The detail was diminished, but it was clearly the impossible monolithic city Alex had dreamed about and raced down toward before he had abruptly awakened. As Alex gaped, Megan picked up the drawing and prepared to put it into her folder. "Wait!" Alex said, rather loudly, because this time Megan did jump, looking over her shoulder at him with her eyes wide and her face pale. "What?" she asked in a slight squeak, clearly taken aback by Alex's forcefulness. Alex was sorry to have caused Megan such alarm, but even that fact was not as important as what he was seeing and its implications. He lowered his voice to keep it from being heard above the ambient between-classes noise level and asked, "Where did you get the idea for that picture?" Megan's previous startlement left her, apparently, and was replaced by shock and puzzlement, as well as a deeper but subtler form of alarm, because instead of answering, she responded with a question of her own, saying, "Why do you ask?" Alex couldn't force himself to speak for several seconds, afraid to hear what he meant to say out loud. Unfortunately, there was no way around the facts. He could not see how her drawing, which matched his vision so well, could possibly be a coincidence. Clearing his throat once and then hemming and hawing a bit, he said, because last night I had a really weird dream where I saw a place that looked just like the one in your drawing." Now, for the first time, Megan truly looked frightened, but Alex didn't get the impression that she was frightened of him. She stared at him, eyes wide and mouth slightly open, her color pale, but she did not in any way recoil from his presence. Rather, she simply gaped, and Alex began to suspect what she was going to say before she finally began to talk. You had a dream about this place?" she asked. Alex nodded and said, "Yeah, I did. Last night. I was flying up through the air above my house, and then everything kind of changed, and I was someplace else, someplace that looked a lot like what you drew. And I flew toward that cliff and that huge place, and then I flew down toward this garden thing up in the top tower and woke up just before I hit the ground." Now, if anything, Megan was gaping even more. Yet she didn't delay as long this time before saying, "But, no, how can that be?" "How can what be?" Alex asked, though again he thought he knew what she was going to say. I had almost the same dream," she replied. "I was in the air, and the color of the sky and the ground changed, and then I went toward that place and up above it, and, well, I woke up before I started going down, I guess, but otherwise—" She paused, closed her mouth, and swallowed before finishing, "Otherwise, it's almost just the same." Alex sat down at the desk next to hers because, though he had expected it, Megan's revelation that her dream had been nearly identical to his made him feel wobbly and weak. He didn't even want to ask her whether after she had awakened she had heard or seen an airborne monster. Surely if she had, she would have been drawing that as well. If anything, it was even more striking and memorable than the dreamscape had been. Instead, staring at Megan's troubled face, he just asked, "What do you think's going on?" Megan, staring right back at him, replied, "I don't know. I mean, I don't usually have dreams like that. It was really strange. And for us to have almost the same dream about the same place, I mean, it can't be just a coincidence, can it?" As Megan mentioned the idea of a coincidence, another thought sprung fully formed into Alex's mind. "Simon!" he exclaimed, much to Megan's obvious puzzlement. "What about Simon?" she asked him. Alex blinked a few times. He had recalled how Simon had been so tired that morning, that he had arrived at school earlier than usual, and also that he had seemed more than a little uncomfortable when discussing why he had lost sleep. Could Simon also have had a vision that disturbed his rest? It seemed preposterous that yet a third person should have a dream just like two others, but that was what Alex suspected had happened. He wasn't ready to reveal that thought to Megan, though. Instead, he told her, "Well, Simon's really smart. Maybe he can help us figure this out." He looked up and around. The clock showed less than 2 minutes until the class officially started, and the other 2 members of his and Megan's Crucible discussion group would be arriving momentarily. They could not continue their conversation much longer. "Listen," he proposed. "We need to talk about this, and I want to go over it with Simon, too. Can you meet up with him and me right after school by the front of the building?" Megan looked hesitant, almost as she had before taking the fruit, but then she nodded sharply. Yes, that'll be okay, as long as we don't take too long. I want to talk about this, and Simon will probably be able to explain it." Alex wasn't quite so sure, and he was perversely not too pleased by her implicit trust in his best friend, but he nodded anyway. "Yeah," he said, "I think he will." They looked at each other, Alex deeply troubled and Megan giving all appearance of feeling the same way. Soon the 2 final members of their group arrived and sat down, greeting them. If the other students noticed that Megan and Alex were preoccupied, they gave no sign of it. It was difficult for Alex to concentrate in class and in his subsequent classes as well. In 4th period, he didn't feel ready to talk to Simon about what he and Megan had discovered about each other's similar dreams, and he hadn't quite worked up the nerve to bring up the question of what had kept Simon awake the night before. Instead, he simply confirmed with his friend that they would be meeting after school. Since this was what they did almost every day, it wasn't difficult. He didn't feel like telling Simon yet that Megan would be meeting them as well. He wasn't sure whether this was part of the nervousness he felt about the dreams and other disturbances, or was just a desire for once to have one up on his friend when it came to the girl he liked. The rest of the school day passed without any further strange sights or new insights, and before long the last bell rang. It wasn't an end-of-day homeroom day, and Alex had science class last period, without Simon, a fact that he always lamented, so they were not together as he left. Alex went to his locker and put some of his books away, took his jacket and stuffed it into his backpack with the 1 or 2 books he needed to take home, and then slung the now puffy bag over one shoulder before closing his locker. He walked toward the front of the building with some trepidation. He had the urge to walk more slowly than usual, but knew that wouldn't help anything, so he countered it by walking briskly. He needed to figure these bizarre occurrences out, and he had to get Simon involved, not only to figure out what had kept him from sleeping, but also to get his thoughts. It was simply a fact that Simon was very smart, and might have ideas about this concordance of dreams and Alex's bizarre visions, even if he hadn't shared any dreams himself. Soon Alex walked through the front doors of the school and saw his friend already waiting near the flagpoles. Simon waved, still looking tired, but he seemed otherwise happy and untroubled, and Alex almost felt guilty about the subject he was about to raise. "Hey, Alex," Simon greeted. "You ready to go?" He hoisted his book bag, which had been resting on the concrete bench near the flagpoles, and swung it over his shoulder. "Just a minute," Alex answered, putting his own bag down. "I asked Megan to meet us here after school." Simon blinked at Alex momentarily before smirking and saying, "Man, you don't give up very easily, do you? Did she say okay?" Alex nodded and said, "Yeah, but it's not what you think. It's about something we were talking about in our English class, and we wanted to ask you what you thought about it. And I wanted to ask you something, too." Simon's smirk left him, but he didn't look troubled, just confused. "Why do you need to wait to ask me something? You've seen me all day." Alex answered, "Because it's about what Megan and I talked about, and I figured it'd make more sense to talk about it when she's here." As if speaking of her had conjured her appearance, at that moment Megan walked through the other set of front doors of the school, looking over to where Simon and Alex stood. She visibly hesitated for several seconds before resolutely walking forward, if at a slightly hesitant pace. As she drew closer, she greeted them with, "Hi, Simon. Hi, Alex." Alex found himself briefly and absurdly pleased that she had spoken his name without hesitation. Of course, sharing a bizarre dream with someone would stick in a person's mind, and it was not necessarily a good association. Still, any connection was better than none. Resisting the urge to grin, and reminding himself how serious and strange was the subject matter about which they were going to speak, Alex responded simply, "Hey, Megan." Simon followed suit, his voice carrying a combination of amusement and puzzlement. "Hi, Megan," he said. "So what brings you to this little gathering?" Megan looked surprised by the question, and as she came within easy conversational distance and drew to a stop, she looked at Alex and asked, "Did you tell him anything about it?" Alex shook his head and said, "No, I wanted to wait until you were here. And actually, before telling him anything at all, I wanted to show him that drawing you did." Megan was clearly puzzled by this idea, and Alex spared a moment to bemoan the fact that he seemed to make her feel that way quite often. Nevertheless, he wanted to see if Simon had dreamed the same dream he and Megan had both had, or one like it, and the drawing was the most reliable way to determine that. "Yeah, I know," he replied to Megan's unasked question. "I want him to see it before we ask him anything, so he'll get a good idea of what we're talking about." He wasn't, of course, being completely truthful, but it was a part of the truth, and he couldn't tell her the other reason, that he wanted to see if Simon reacted the way he himself had reacted when he saw the picture, without missing the whole point. "Okay," Megan said. She put her own backpack down on the concrete ring that surrounded the flagpoles and unzipped it. Fishing inside, she pulled out a folder. She held it facing herself, so it wasn't possible for Simon to have seen it yet, and even when she took her picture out of the folder, she held it close to her chest for several seconds. Alex guessed that she was self-conscious about her artwork because she glanced up at Simon shyly. Then, rather to Alex's surprise, she passed the drawing over to him instead of Simon. Alex took the drawing without hesitation, and after waiting a moment to steel himself, he handed it on to Simon, asking, "What do you think about that?" Alex imagined that Megan was probably confused by his lack of explanation, but he couldn't be sure because he wasn't looking at her. He was watching Simon to see what his reaction was, and he wasn't disappointed. At first, Simon just took the page with a bemused look, then he glanced down. Upon seeing the drawing, his expression underwent an instant and profound transformation. His eyes widened, and he stared, his mouth opened slightly, and his face became visibly paler. Alex was, in fact, rather startled by the degree of change in his expression. Simon's fatigue from earlier in the day returned and then exceeded all that had been there that morning, overlaid with no small amount of actual fear. In honest concern, Alex asked, "Are you okay?" instead of asking him whether he had seen the edifice depicted in the picture before. Simon briefly glanced up at Alex, then back down at the picture. He began. How is this possible?" After only a moment of hesitation, Alex pressed his original concern. "How is what possible?" Simon glanced up again, then looked down, then finally looked up at Alex again before turning his gaze to Megan. How did you know about this? How could you draw this?" Megan bore signs of clear and intense surprise. She had not, of course, had any reason to think that Simon might recognize the building in her drawing. Alex, however, had expected such a reaction, if perhaps with less fear and pallor. Megan said, I saw it in a dream last night, just like Alex did." If Simon had looked stunned before, he looked completely flabbergasted now. He looked back and forth from Megan's face to Alex's, clearly trying to discern if, somehow, they had decided to play a prank on him. Alex could almost hear the wheels turning in his friend's head as Simon ruled out the possibility, since there would have been no way for them to know to pull such a prank unless they had been privy to his own dream, or one just like it. That would have been just as uncanny and inexplicable as what they were saying, and in its own way just as improbable. It would have been comical had the situation, and Simon's reaction, not been so alarming. "Alex," Simon finally stammered, "is that true?" Slowly, Alex nodded and said, "Yeah, it is. I came into English class this morning and saw this drawing that Megan had been working on, and it was a place I had a dream about last night. A really weird and intense dream. And we realized that our dreams had been almost exactly alike. Obviously, we didn't know what it means. I don't know how something like that could happen. Then I remembered that you seemed tired this morning and said that you had a bad night's sleep, and I wondered if you'd had a dream like that too." He paused for a moment and then added, "I guess you did, huh?" This time, without hesitating at all, Simon nodded and answered, "Yes! I had this dream where I was floating in the air over my house, and then everything kind of started changing and turning into this different place, like Mars or something, except with a few plants. It was all reddish-brown and with a reddish sky, and I floated over toward this huge canyon or cliff or something and flew along until I saw that, I don't know what you'd call it, a building, a city? It was definitely impossible because it was hanging out over the edge of the cliff just by this stalk of rock. There was no way it could stay up. But it seemed so real. I started flying toward it and then down toward the top. I felt like I was going to run into it if it kept coming, but I suddenly woke up and, well, after that I had a hard time getting back to sleep. Megan had been nodding her head steadily, almost as if entranced, while Simon recounted his dream. Alex recognized that it was just like his own and Megan's, of course, and he also noted that Simon sounded as if it had gone on slightly longer than Megan's, though not quite as long as his own. He did, however, have one additional question to ask his friend, one that he felt more strongly about because of the way Simon had said that he had a hard time getting back to sleep afterwards, and because of the fact that, unlike Megan, Simon lived within just over a block of his house. "After you woke up," Alex asked, "did anything else happen? Did you hear anything?" Once again Simon started, but out of the corner of his eye Alex saw that Megan merely looked puzzled by the question. Simon looked at Alex with a visible increase in fear. What sort of anything do you mean?" he asked. Megan continued to stare at both boys quizzically, but now her face showed more alarm, apparently in response to Simon's open fright. Alex found that he needed to swallow to clear his voice before he could speak again, for though he had little doubt about his conclusions, it was something else entirely to say them. In a voice that sounded surprisingly calm to his own ears, he said, "Some kind of animal noise or shriek. Something in the sky?" Simon was clearly, and interestingly, already arriving at the conclusion that Alex had pondered all day, for though he was clearly still frightened, his eyes hardened with concentration as he said, "Yes, I heard that. And you heard it too." He looked past Alex at Megan and added, "But you didn't, did you?" Megan, clearly still taken by surprise, simply shook her head. Alex was going to speak, but Simon continued too quickly, saying, "Which means that the noise wasn't part of that dream. It was probably real, and it was close to our houses, but not close to Megan's." Alex was amazed at the speed with which Simon had thought things through. He felt as if he were watching a middle school Sherlock Holmes. Of course, Simon was quite right about where the sound had come from, but the next point Alex was about to make was one he doubted Simon had guessed. "Oh, it was by our houses, all right. In fact, it went right over my house. I saw it." As Alex had expected, Simon was clearly stunned by this revelation, though his fear did not seem to increase. Megan was obviously still just puzzled, but she was too shy or perhaps just too wrong-footed to say anything. Instead, Simon asked, "Was it some kind of bird?" Alex hesitated before shaking his head. "No, it wasn't a bird," he said. "It was flying and it had wings, but no, it wasn't a bird." Megan now finally overcame her natural reticence and asked, "What are you guys talking about? I thought we were going to talk about our dream." Alex turned to look fully at her, saying, "We are. I think the thing Simon and I heard is connected with the dream." "Wait a second," Simon broke in before Alex could go any further. "What do you mean it wasn't a bird? It was flying? It had wings? What else could it be? I mean, it doesn't sound like a bat, and I know it wasn't an airplane." Alex almost laughed at Simon's entirely true statement. He said, "No, it definitely wasn't an airplane. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen before. I mean, I couldn't make it out too well. It was nighttime, and I really didn't want to take a chance that it might see me, but it looked a little bit like one of those giant manta rays." Simon, now even more puzzled, though clearly forgetting some of his shock and fear, shook his head, saying, "It's impossible. There's no such thing as a flying manta ray. I mean, they jump out of the water, but they don't fly." Alex shrugged and responded, "There's no such thing as three people all having the same dream about the exact same place that none of us have ever seen before, but we did." Simon was clearly nonplussed. "But, well, I mean, dreams are one thing, but..." Megan seemed to have lost much of her hesitancy, and she said, "So you're saying that right after you woke up from that weird dream, you guys both heard something just as weird as the dream, and you saw it, Alex?" "Yeah, basically," Alex replied. "I was still kind of freaking out about the dream, so at first I thought I might still be asleep, but it really seemed a lot different. It felt different. I know that I was awake, Simon offered. I fell out of bed when I woke up from my dream. It was a miracle I didn't wake anyone up. With that statement, a thought seemed to occur to him, and he added, "Hey, did anyone else at your house hear it?" Alex shook his head fervently. "Nope," he said. "No one woke up. And they should have. It was pretty loud." Simon shook his head, still clearly having trouble absorbing everything. "I don't understand," he said. "How is it that we could both hear noises that didn't wake anyone else up? And how could you see some flying thing that isn't a bird or a bat, but looks like a manta ray, for crying out loud?" "I don't know," Alex was forced to reply. "How can we all three have had the same dream?" Megan cleared her throat and asked, "And do you really think they're all connected together? I mean, the dream and what you guys heard and what Alex saw?" Alex was a bit surprised that she even had to ask, but realized that he may have made an unwarranted assumption based on the timing of the occurrences. Before he could admit the possibility that he had jumped to conclusions, Simon shook his head and said, "I don't really know what's going on, but I think they've got to be connected. I mean, what are the odds of two really weird but completely separate things happening at the same time on the same night?" "I don't know," Alex admitted, "but if there's one weird thing, why not two?" "Because," Simon replied, "however unlikely either weird thing is by itself, the odds of two weird, different things happening at the same time are way smaller. Like being hit by lightning during a shark attack. But a shark attack on dry land without a cloud in the sky, because I don't see how any of these things could be happening." "But," Megan said, "well, we know they happen, so it doesn't matter if they seem impossible." Alex nodded vigorously and added, "It's definitely true that we all had the same dream. I mean, I know what I dreamed, and I didn't say anything about it to anyone, but Megan drew her picture, and I saw it and recognized it. And when I told her my dream, she said it was just like the one she had, and I didn't give you any hints about the dream before showing you the picture." Simon nodded in return, saying, Right, yeah, I know. I mean, I guess I don't see any way around the fact that we all had the same dream, even though it's weird. I mean, I just don't know how it could happen. But, well, maybe the thing Alex thought he saw could be some kind of hallucination. "I didn't just see it, I heard it," Alex said, feeling a bit offended by Simon's suggestion. "And you heard it too, the same thing I heard." "Well," Simon said, dithering a little, Well, we don't know for sure that we heard the same thing." Alex gaped at him, saying, "Oh, come on, you can't be serious. You just said the odds of two different weird things happening at the same time are a lot less than the two things being part of the same thing. What are the odds of two of us hearing two weird but different noises at the same time?" Simon looked steadily at him, blinking a few times before admitting, "Yeah, okay, you're right." Several seconds of uncomfortable silence followed. Then Megan asked, "So what do you think is going on, Simon?" Simon took a deep breath in and let it out before admitting, "I don't know. I haven't ever heard of anything like this before. I mean, it'd be one thing if we all three had done the same thing, then all dreamed about it, but we didn't do anything like that. Besides school, I don't know what we'd have done that we'd all dream about." They stood in silence for a moment. Alice was disappointed that Simon hadn't been able to come up with an answer or explanation, though he didn't know what he should have expected. It wasn't as though he himself had any great ideas. He didn't want to mention the tale he had seen that morning before homeroom. Neither Simon nor Megan had mentioned seeing any such thing, and he felt a bit worried about being the only one who had seen a dinosaur tail in a backyard behind the school. The other two might unite in thinking him insane, even given what they had all seen. Finally breaking the silence, he said, "Well, I guess we're not going to figure this out right here and now." "Yeah," Simon said, then quickly added, "Sorry." Megan looked down at Simon's watch and gave a mild start, remarking, "Oh, wow, I've got to get going. It's already getting late." Alex nodded and said, "Yeah." He picked his backpack up from the bench, and Simon followed suit after handing Megan back her drawing, which she returned to her own bag before slinging it over her shoulder. They started to walk together, the two boys very naturally including Megan. Alex felt a certain inevitable joy about her presence, but it was overshadowed by the general air of preoccupation they all shared. They didn't discuss their shared experiences any further. Indeed, they said very little at all. They separated when they reached Alex's house, Simon not coming in with Alex this time, but instead walking on with Megan after the two gave Alex a brief goodbye. Alex walked into his home glumly. He didn't go into the dining room. He didn't recall his brief fright from the previous afternoon, nor the fruit that he, Simon, and Megan had shared. Those events were far less keen in his mind than his recent conversation, and the more recent events they had discussed. He walked to his room and, after putting his bag on the floor, laid down in his bed and stared at the ceiling, puzzled and anxious. He stayed there for a long time before beginning his homework.